Well, this is working. Robert?
Sorry, hold on 1 second.
Trina?
It's working. I think
Is it working?
sounds like it sounds.
Okay.
You sound amplified.
I don't hear anything.
Yeah. Do you want me to check?
Yeah, I'm going to just check, just to make sure for everyone is. Yeah, it's working, that's fine. Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
On behalf of my colleagues at Africana Studies and Research Center, and with great pleasure that I welcome you all to the opening session of our conference, Historiography and African American Intellectual History, a conference dedicated to the celebration of the remarkable career of our colleague, Professor Robert Harris at Cornell. We gather here today on the occasion of Professor Harris' retirement after close to 40 years of dedicated service to Africana studies and Cornell at large and to the field of African American history. In all of these places and spaces and times, Bob Harris exhibited the uncommon combination of a productive scholar, a dedicated teacher, and a great citizen of the profession. I would like to welcome Dean Peter Lepage, the Harold Tanner, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University. Just wait. There's more to say. And to thank him for taking the time to attend our opening session and to say a few words on behalf of the Cornell administration in honor of Professor Harris' contribution to Cornell. Allow me also to thank the staff of Africana, who worked very hard behind the scene to organize all the logistics to make this conference possible. More specifically, I would like to thank Ms. Trina Levine, who I'm sure many of you have communicated with her or seen her, with our administrative manager, Ms. Renee Milligan, and Ms. Robin Coleman, our graduate student who assisted me and the office here in preparing for this conference. I'm also very grateful to Ramis Elias, the graphic designer, who, as usual, did a wonderful job in designing the poster, as you've seen it outside, and the program, which I hope all of you have, and the website for the conference, as he normally does with our publicity. Above all, I would like to thank our guest speakers, colleagues of Professor Harris, and former students who travel across the country, not only to participate in this occasion, but took the time from, I'm sure, a very, very busy schedule to write papers for this special occasion. I would also like to thank my colleagues in Africana and across campus for agreeing to serve as moderators and discussants for our papers, for the papers to be presented at the panel today and tomorrow. I would like to extend a special welcome, and please join me in this, to the members of the family of Professor Harris. His wife, Anita Harris, and his daughter Lisa, and his son-in-law, Kenneth Robinson, his daughter Leslie, and his son-in-law Jeremy Alexander, I think he's there. As well as his grandson, I didn't forget about you, Jesse Alexander. Okay. And daughter also Lauren Harris, and his also sister-in-law, and rare gifts. To all of you, family of Professor Harris, and to all our presenters, moderators, and discussants, and to everyone in the audience, I would like to express actually my utmost gratitude, and I would say that we are very, very grateful and very, very honored by your presence. Allow me now to begin our conference by asking my colleague, Professor Gerard Aching, the Director of Africana Studies at the Study Center, to make his welcoming remarks on behalf of Africana. Professor Aching will be followed by Professor Peter Lepage, the Dean of the College of Art and Science, who will also say a few words, as I said earlier, on behalf of the college and the Cornell administration. Please join me in welcoming both of them in the order stated. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hassan. Good afternoon. I am Gerard Aching, Director of the Africana Studies and Research Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this conference in honor of our esteemed colleague, Professor Robert L. Harris, Jr., who is said to be retiring sometime soon. Historians, I would venture to say, do not retire. Or at least they should not be allowed to, because they are practiced in the ways of seeing things, events, lives, writings, archives, knowledge, that the rest of us require in order to feel more at home in the world. No, they should not be allowed to retire, especially if, when working in the field of African American history, they possess and exercise what Du Bois called the gift of second sight in this American world. A gift that has enabled the African American and Du Bois's thinking has global applications here to see through and beyond the binds of double consciousness. The title of this conference is Historiography and African American Intellectual History, which is not surprising in light of the scholarship and the communities to which Professor Harris has devoted a lifetime of research, reflection, and teaching. Yet I cannot help but believe that the gift of second sight, that ability to imagine, visualize, evaluate, and account for knowledge that is not apparent to everyone, is also the stuff of historiography for the field of African American history and beyond. What and how does the writing of African American intellectual history allow us to see? Therein lies the challenge that Professor Harris has set before himself as a scholar, before his colleagues in the field, and before our conference participants today. No pressure. In recent years, many scholars in the humanities have been reflecting on and negotiating how to approach the relationship between the archive and performance. They might ask, for example, how to investigate and relate past performances in the areas of music, sports, or political campaigns, if these activities are not available in any sort of archive. The dynamics and immediacy of a performance challenge anyone who wishes to provide a worthwhile account of it. And this, in fact, is my task, as I recall when at the end of a recent faculty meeting, Professor Harris began to express his outrage not only at the overpopulation of deer in his neighborhood, but at the fact that they dared to enter his property and ravage his garden. Those of us who have known Professor Harris for a long time already know what his humor is capable of. But he was merciless with us, as every mark that he uttered became increasingly hostile toward these animals. He had us in stitches and he would not let up. A word of caution to those of you who are from out of town: whatever you do this weekend, do not raise the subject of deer in Cayuga Heights with Professor Harris. The historian as stand-up comic? Yes, for this was a side of the serious scholar that I had not seen before, but a humanizing moment for all of us. You had to be there. Which, by the way, is an expression that can intimate an apology. If I use the expression, it could be seen as an admission on my part that I have failed to capture that event accurately. Nevertheless, I don't know of another scholarly field, like history, that prides itself as much on its methods for taking us there. That is to say, taking us back to those moments of the past that mean or should mean something for us. At Africana, we are indebted to Professor Harris for the acclaim that he has brought to this center through prestigious grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Ford Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation, for his solid leadership of Africana from 1986 to 1991, and from 2010 to 11, for his groundbreaking leadership as Cornell's Vice Provost for Diversity and Faculty Development from 2000 to 2008, for his commitment to students inside and outside the classroom, which has been amply recognized by student organizations and university awards. In addition to the good name that Professor Harris gives us in his roles as a scholar, teacher, and administrator, we are also the recipients of his good-natured disposition, his concern for fairness in academic and professional life, and his generosity. We are indebted. So even though there is talk of retirement, there is no doubt that Professor Harris will continue to work on the history of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, which was founded at Cornell in 1906, on his biography on educator, diplomat, and All-American football star of this institution, Jerome Hartwell Holland, and on many other projects. A proper and well-deserved celebration is in order, and on behalf of Africana, it is my honor to inaugurate this very special occasion with a warm welcome to you all, and the heartiest of congratulations to our Professor Robert L. Harris, Jr. Thank you. And I would now like to invite Dean Peter Lepage, of Arts and Sciences Dean, the Harold Tanner Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, to say a few words. Thank you.
And I want to welcome, especially our visitors. I'm honored to welcome you on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences in Cornell to this wonderful celebration of a wonderful colleague. I actually first got to know Bob pretty close to exactly 10 years ago when I became dean, and he was vice provost for diversity and faculty development, a role where his generosity, his integrity, his humor is put to use almost all the time. It's an era when Cornell was really putting much closer attention onto these issues than it had in the past, and Bob was a key person in ushering in that era. I'm also very grateful to his steady leadership of Africana twice, including recently during a difficult transition. It's a very, very important contribution to Cornell and to Africana. I think, though, above all else, what I value as a dean and an academic is the almost 4 decades of research and writing, the almost 4 decades of public engagement, and especially the almost 4 decades of teaching and mentoring of students. That's very, very special and something that is really worthy of celebration. So I'm not going to hold these proceedings up anymore, but I do want to congratulate Bob and thank you on behalf of the university. I want to wish all our visitors and all of you a great meeting. Have a lot of fun over the next 2 days. It looks like a great program. So congratulations, Bob. Thank you.
We will continue with our panels. We'll start with the opening keynote address. I just want to at least mention a change in the schedule, which was due to unforeseen circumstances. Professor Adam Green, who I'm sure some of you have seen in the earlier version of the program, was to be the keynote speaker. He's not able to be with us today to deliver the keynote address due to family-related circumstances. But I'm very, very grateful to Professor Kevin Gaines, to the University of Michigan, who gracefully agreed to step in and deliver his paper as a keynote address for this evening. The sessions will proceed at the plan for tomorrow, and Professor Gaines, after delivering this, he will be at the panel to answer any questions or engage in a further discussion, which he may not be able to do today. So please join me in welcoming first Professor James Turner, Emeritus Professor and Founding Director of Africana Studies, who will be introducing Professor Kevin Gaines. Professor Turner.
I have tried desperately, and I want to confess to you now so that you don't later take my failings too much to heart. I tried to find a wonderful Chicago connection to this event. I thought maybe Chicago was involved in the Final Four. I said, no, nothing happened. I thought maybe the mayor of Chicago had made some significant response that he was going to rescind the order to close 50 schools in Chicago. But as try as I may, I couldn't come up with anything. Sure, so I want to confess. Because any of you know Bob Harris, there's almost one thing he has no objectivity on. That's connection to Chicago. And I think the reason why he decided to come here and join us at the Africana Center is he thought I was from Chicago. Since I was up the road a bit north of Chicago. So Bob, I want to ask for your forgiveness on this shortcoming, but maybe before the end of the weekend, we will have some communication from Chicago. I am pleased to welcome Dr. Kevin Gaines to the Africana Studies and Research Center, as my colleagues have also indicated, for this tribute to Robert Harris on his imminent retirement. I'm not being conclusive about it for reasons that's already been said. But Dr. Gaines earned his doctorate from Brown University in 1991. While working toward his terminal degree, he was jazz director at WBRU-FM in Providence, Rhode Island. And perhaps then it was he began to develop his interest in African-American cultural production and performance. From 1991 to 1996, he was an assistant professor at Princeton University, then an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin from 1996 to 1999. He joined the faculty at the University of Michigan in African American and African Studies as associate professor from 1999 to 2005. From 2005 to 2010, he was professor of history in African American and African Studies. And during this time, he served as director of the Center for African American and African Studies. Since 2010, Kevin Gaines has been the Robert Hayden Collegiate Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Michigan. He is the author of American Africans in Ghana, Black Expatriates in the Civil Rights Movement, Civil Rights Era, published in 2006. and the uplifting of the race, black leadership, politics, culture, and culture during the 20th century, published in 1996. He also has an article in Rosalind and Bob's text entitled which he authored with his wife, Penny von Esten, entitled African American Literature and the Arts. He is also the winner of the John Hope Franklin Book Prize of the American Studies Association in 1997. His fields of study include United States and African American intellectual and cultural history, race and gender, politics in the post-World War II America, African American cultural production, the global dimensions of the United States, and the struggles over the meaning of citizenship. He was elected president of the American Studies Association in 2008. In his keynote lecture for this conference, Professor Gaines will contest an item of conventional wisdom in African American studies, which is a widely held belief by most historians that defines Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition speech as a moment of acquiescence to racial segregation and disenfranchisement in national politics, an occasion, it's been assumed, having nothing to do with Africa. This lecture this afternoon is entitled The Congress on Africa, 1895, African Americans and Africa during the colonization of Africa and United States Jim Crow segregation. I am pleased to invite Professor Kevin Gaines to the podium.
Thank you, Professor Turner, for that gracious introduction. I should also thank Professor Salah Hassan for all the work that he has done to put together this program, which I'm really looking forward to, and also Professor Aching and Treva Levine for making it possible for all of us to be here. I should just say briefly about my connection with Bob, the article that Penny and I contributed to the Columbia Encyclopedia of African American Culture, commissioned by Bob and Rosalind. It was a very interesting commission. They asked us to write about African American literature, art, drama, film, and dance since 1940. And I thought, that's an intriguing request. And it was just kind of hard to turn it down because it just seemed so impossible. But when I finally got the book, I understood why the request came as it did with us writing about all of these different areas of cultural production. I saw that Craig Werner and Robin Kelly had done articles on music, and so I think that we were basically commissioned to write about everything else. So anyway, that's my impression. But it was really an honor to write that article, a challenge, and it really made a big difference for the work that I would do in terms of teaching and scholarship as well. And let me also just echo the congratulations to to Bob on the occasion of his retirement. And also I want to congratulate the family. It's really nice to see all the family here. But the family often does not get proper recognition, public recognition for their support. So if you could have a round of applause for the family. So, as Professor Turner said, the title of my presentation is The Congress on Africa, 1895, African Americans in Africa in the Age of the Colonization of Africa and U.S. Jim Crow Segregation. And so I'm hoping that there'll be some time afterward that we can have some question and answer. This is very preliminary work, and so I'm hoping to hear from your questions and comments what this is really about. That Booker T. Washington's address at the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta in the fall of 1895 was a turning point in African American leadership is well known. Less than a year after the death of Frederick Douglass, the venerable former slave, abolitionist, and preeminent agitator for equal rights, Washington captured the imagination of the white South with his renunciation of political rights for blacks and his vision of economic cooperation between the black peasantry and white employers in the South. Little remarked, however, is the extent to which Washington's remarks went well beyond capitulating to widespread attempts to discouraging black voting and electoral politics. For Washington's speech also contained a rejection of the grassroots politics of emigration and mobility that offered a disfranchised African American population virtually its only path for political and economic action throughout the late 19th century and well into the 20th. Washington addressed the Atlanta Exposition audience at a moment when AME Church Bishop Henry McNeil Turner and other black leaders advocated emigration to Africa, declaring the violent post-Reconstruction assault on black citizenship to be an intolerable state of affairs. For besieged African Americans, mobility, whether emigration or internal migration, had become a familiar course of action. In 1892, the journalist Ida B. Wells had counseled blacks in Memphis to retaliate against lynching without migration, taking with them their power as workers and consumers as a means of punishing white authorities for condoning anti-black violence. Faced with Jim Crow conditions of violence and poverty, Southern African Americans deluged the American Colonization Society with appeals for asylum in Liberia during the 1890s. Black and white spokespersons and press editors hotly debated whether emigration to Liberia was a sensible or foolhardy course. Booker T. Washington briefly alluded to the issue of emigration in his Atlanta Exposition address. He did not support emigration. Like Ida B. Wells, Washington understood that emigration by African Americans, or even mobility within the region, resisted white employers' efforts to impose control over African American labor. Hence, Washington hastened to advise, and I'm quoting Washington here, "Those of my race who depend on bettering their condition in a foreign land, I would say, cast down your bucket where you are, cast it down in making friends in every manly way of the people of all races by whom we are surrounded." End of quote. In calling for the African American masses to cast their lot within the political economy of the New South, Washington opposed popular emigrationist sentiment and activity, particularly among rural black Southerners who looked to Liberia as a place where they might realize the aspirations for freedom and economic autonomy that had proved elusive for so many since emancipation. Black and white elites alike rallied to Washington's optimistic appeal for common ground between white employers and black labor. Yet, as an opponent of immigration and mobility, Washington seemed intent on indefinitely circumscribing the lives of black Americans within the confines of the Jim Crow South and the American nation at a moment of crisis. The attention bestowed by countless historians on Washington's success in achieving preeminence in black leadership and politics seems to have echoed an intended effect of his speech. Washington marginalized the persistent allure of Africa for many blacks as a solution to the dashed hopes of African Americans in the generations after emancipation. Historians have defined Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech as a moment of acquiescence to segregation and disfranchisement in national politics, having little, if anything, to do with Africa. Following the work of Michelle Mitchell and Stephen Hahn and others, which has suggested that black nationalism, chiefly a desire to escape white supremacist terror, was a central rather than peripheral preoccupation of Southern rural African Americans, I want to focus on another quite distinct occasion of interracial cooperation at the Atlanta Exposition that has been obscured by Washington's triumph. The three-day Congress on Africa, which took place from December 13th through 15th, appears to have attracted little attention compared to the nationwide praise generated by Washington's remarks several weeks before. Sponsored by the Gammon Theological Seminary based in Atlanta, the Congress brought together black and white ministers and missionaries, scholars, and journalists for the purpose of encouraging African Americans to participate in the evangelization of Africa. While many of the speakers reflected the dominant Protestant Christianity of the time and some endorsed the view of Africa as a dark continent awaiting redemption through the spread of the gospel and the effectiveness of the civilizing mission, the Congress on Africa also provided a forum for some of the African American commentators to engage in vigorous and wide-ranging debate on the significance of Europe's partition and colonization of Africa. If Washington's Atlanta Exposition address arguably marks a hegemonic closure as the Tuskegee educator consolidated his power at the expense of what had been a spirited and ideologically diverse black leadership class, the Congress on Africa provided African American ministers and spokespersons an occasion for voicing a contested diasporic vision of black nationalist ideas that, like Washington's speech, addressed and reflected issues and debates at the center of African American politics and public culture. These issues included the cultural identity of African Americans, the future of the Negro and his quest for power in the modern world, African Americans' relationship to the U.S. government, and of course, ongoing global processes of the evangelization and colonization of Africa. For many of the African American participants, the conviction that African American men and women might play a crucial role in the evangelization of Africa was, in effect, an elite counterpart of the popular immigrationism of the black masses. In their emphasis on Africa as a field for endeavor for African American male leadership, many of the speakers had little to say about the violent exclusion of rural blacks from politics, with the exception of the militant emigrationist Bishop Turner. The African American men at the Congress who advocated missionary work in Africa as a humanitarian project were making a bid for civic leadership after the racist exclusion from electoral politics. Hence their steady drift to churches, schools, newspapers, and other civic institutions as sites of leadership and community building. At the Congress, aspiring black male leaders were eager to define their place within and their relationship to ongoing colonial and evangelical projects in Africa. Their leadership and class aspirations thus aligned with their positive view of colonization and evangelization, rendering the divinely ordained service of civilization and regeneration in Africa. Yet beneath the surface concern for evangelization, men who spoke at the Congress engaged in a wide-ranging debate that highlighted contributions by themselves and others in the area of critical knowledge production about Africa. The interracial gathering of elite men interested in the future of Africa and the American Negro allowed for political commentary on issues of European colonization, the slave trade, and the most effective strategies for missionary work. At least implicitly, I want to question the influence of particular narrative approaches to African American history. When I first encountered the proceedings of the Congress on Africa, compiled and edited by the African American minister J.W.E. Bowen, I struggled to incorporate it into a narrative of African American leadership, politics, and middle-class ideology that I viewed occurring largely within a U.S. terrain. I was frankly skeptical of the missionary zeal and the 19th century racialist assumptions of some of the participants, and uncomfortable with the absolutism of their view of the gospel as the antidote to backward or lesser, quote-unquote, lesser African cultures. Less consciously, perhaps, I bought into the view that black nationalism was marginal, a diversion from the centrality of the struggle in the U.S. for civil and political rights and freedom. Conducting my research during the 1990s, critical of the gendered self-help politics of black nationalism and Afrocentrism, I frankly brought a prejudiced framework to my admittedly superficial reading of the proceedings of the Congress. Since then, with the benefit of the work of Nell Painter on the Kansas Exodus, and also Professors Mitchell and Hahn, it is now possible, for me at least, to imagine a narrative that locates immigration, black nationalism, and the Congress on Africa within the so-called mainstream of African American politics of the late 19th century. My goal in revisiting the Congress in Africa is to make a case for the centrality of the discussions of African affairs that occurred at the Congress for African Americans, and their importance for a narrative of the history of black diaspora modernity. I also want to suggest that this diasporic perspective and narrative suggested by immigration and evangelization of Africa challenged Washington's attempted imposition of domestic U.S. terms and New South terrain on the African American political imagination. It should be noted that practically all that was discussed at the Congress of Africa was thoroughly implicated by U.S. histories of political exclusion from citizenship, and by the involvement of the U.S. in the colonization and evangelization of Africa. After all, Liberia, as an American colony, was integral to the history of slavery and emancipation in the U.S. As such, a study of the Congress on Africa challenges narratives of 19th century African American politics restricted to U.S. terrain, as well as those narratives predicated on a false dichotomy of a black nationalist periphery orbiting an integrationist core. Moreover, in what follows, I hope to resist the temptation to frame my account of the Congress within a teleology marked by the fulfillment of black nationalist or Pan-African aspirations, the historian's equivalent of Ethiopia shall stretch forth its hands unto God. Rather, through close readings of the addresses of some of the participants, I want to suggest their concern for amassing independent knowledge production about Africa, as well as the messy complexity of that process, often mediated as it was by 19th century ideologies of race. As the work of Brandy Hughes on African American missionaries in Africa during the late 19th and early 20th century argues, black participation in the evangelization of Africa provided the basis for claims of African American citizenship and equality in the face of racist hostility and exclusion. In promoting a sense of obligation among African Americans to perform missionary work in Africa, the sponsors of the Congress were perhaps unwittingly eroding the physical and ideological ties of educated African Americans to affiliation with the U.S. Southland. Despite the conservatism of their theological approach to the continent, black and white advocates of evangelization at the Congress were treated to a global historical narrative of the slave trade, the Saint-Domingue slave revolt that led to the establishment of the Black Republic of Haiti, an account of the horrors of slavery, the milestones of emancipation throughout the Americas, and affirmations of the post-emancipation evangelical movement of freedmen's and missionary education. This global pageant of slavery, resistance, emancipation, and the march of civilization disrupted the white South's agenda and propaganda of the Negro problem. Indeed, the governor of Georgia, W.Y. Atkinson, affirmed his support for the education of African Americans and their missionary work in Africa. Like most of the speakers, and possibly exhibiting greater flexibility than did Washington, Atkinson viewed emigration as a matter of individual choice, though his view perhaps bore a resemblance to the pro-emigrationist view of racist Southern legislators, and I'm quoting Governor Atkinson. "You are free and independent citizens, and you must decide for yourselves whether you will reside in Georgia or Africa," end of quote. According to J.W.E. Bowen, the Secretary of the Congress and editor of its proceedings, the three-day event in Atlanta attracted, quoting Bowen, enthusiastic, overflowing audiences, many of whom we can assume were local African Americans. It is striking and even daunting to account for the ideological complexity and wide-ranging views of Africa voiced by the participants in the Congress, particularly those of African descent. In a letter of greeting, Edward W. Blyden, invoking the masculinist rhetoric that characterized much of the proceedings, hoped that African Americans would take a greater practical interest in the land of their fathers. Blyden, whose attendance was prevented by illness, conveyed his hope that Britain's armies would convince the refractory chiefs of the Ashanti, still waging military resistance, to renounce, quote, the hoary and pernicious superstitions of the past, end of quote. Along with assumptions of backwardness and paganism, several African travelers and ethnological experts noted the linguistic, religious, and ethnic diversity of the continent's peoples, which some hoped would yield in the fullness of time to a more unitary civilization. Indeed, one commentator grandly spoke of evangelization as a force of linguistic, cultural, and political unification among the Bantu peoples, producing in 100 years, and this is sort of ironic, given that he's speaking in 1895, and you know, not even a century after that, you had Nkrumah as the Prime Minister of Ghana talking about a United States of Africa. That's sort of ironic to hear of this contributor to the session's reference to a great United States of Central Africa under a new and improved edition of our American Constitution, which is fascinating, which would rival the civilization of Europe. Such teleological hopes abounded at the Congress. On the matter of the superiority of Christian civilization and the belief that African Americans and African missionaries were best equipped to achieve this objective, there was little disagreement among the black and white participants in the Congress. And most agreed on the positive humanitarian potential of Europe's partition and colonization of Africa, which would prepare the ground for the evangelization of Africa. All shared the view that Europe's scramble for African colonies would vanquish the African slave trade and its evils, though some of the participants contested this formulation, emphasizing Europe's role in fostering African slave trading. It should be mentioned that African American journalists, who were somewhat less grounded in a religious worldview, tended to doubt that humanitarian motives were uppermost in the minds of European armies and business concerns. What strikes me as most interesting for our purposes of reconsidering this moment is not the African American participants' stated goal of the evangelization of Africa, nor their optimistic view of European colonization as a vehicle for the spread of Christianity. What interests me, besides reading this elite African American engagement with Africa against the simultaneous popularity of emigration among rank-and-file African Americans in the South, is an incipient African American project of independent knowledge production on Africa and its peoples that emerges from select presentations at the Congress. In the published proceedings, Bowen devoted the second part of the volume to, quote, the American Negro, his relation to the civilization and redemption of Africa, end of quote. Lest their missionary cause be confused with emigration as a mass movement, the black and white commentators repeatedly stressed the need for college-trained missionaries, with an equal preference for men possessing agricultural and industrial skills. Notably, the doyen of African American missionaries, the Washington, D.C.-based African Episcopal minister Alexander Crummell, took exception to this elite understanding of evangelization. Crummell believed that African Americans, or any foreigners, could not be effective in ministering to Africans. Crummell's speech on, the title of the speech was The Absolute Need of an Indigenous Missionary Agency, was undoubtedly based on the difficulties he had experienced over 20 years of residence in Liberia. To Crummell, perhaps mindful of the effectiveness of Bishop Samuel Ajayi Crowther of the British Church Missionary Society, and I'm quoting Crummell, intelligent native converts were far superior bearers of the word, as cultural insiders able to convey the gospel in their native language. As Crummell put it, quote, most men know the spirit of their race better than strangers do, end of quote. Though skeptical to the prevailing view that African Americans were uniquely qualified for missionary work in Africa, Crummell's belief that indigenous African culture needed to be taken seriously was echoed in the views of several other African American presenters. A major objective of several of the black contributors was contributing new knowledge about African cultures derived from local study, research, and observation. This anthropological orientation was nevertheless compatible with the view of the superiority of Christian civilization. This scholarly stance was exhibited by Orisha Tuka Faduma, born 1860, died 1946, a Sierra Leonean repatriate of Nigerian Yoruba background and a scholar of religion who had studied at the University of London and at Yale. Born W.J. Davies, he had adopted his African name by combining two Yoruba deities. Faduma contested the prevailing binary of civilization and savagery, contending that Yoruba religion and culture was, as he put it, a native civilization. Arguing for the congruence of Yoruba religion and Christianity, Faduma cited the example of Jesus Christ to illustrate the function of Yoruba deities as mediators between God and man. Faduma's study of Yoruba culture affirmed the universality of the concept of God, invalidating prevailing notions of paganism. But the Yoruba conception of God remained, in his view, distorted in comparison to the gospel. Faduma's other paper at the Congress, Success and Drawbacks of Missionary Work in Africa by an Eyewitness, suggested the practical use to which this anthropological knowledge was to be put. Noting the difficulty to foreign missionaries posed by the profusion of African languages, Faduma insisted that Africans receive instruction of the Word of God in their native language. And I'm quoting Faduma here. Let the white man's language, he meant English, be studied, but not to replace the natives. He seemed to endorse Cromwell's view in maintaining, quote, the aim and purpose of Christian missions is not to Anglicize, not to Americanize, not to Germanize the world, but to Christianize it, end of quote. The grammar of native African languages must be documented and their study made integral to missionary education. He rejected the view that the African convert should be foreignized, compelled to reject his name, his language, his dress. Quote, may I, representing the few who believe in a native Christianity, meaning an indigenous African Christianity, raise a protest? What was true for missionary work in Africa was also true of India, Japan, and other missionary fields. Again, quoting Faduma, if the Christian religion is not the white man's religion, but the religion of Jesus Christ, having life to support every race, let it have a trial in these ethnic races, end of quote. Faduma went on to denounce the spirit of paternalism in missions, the failure to impart industrial training and a rounded Christianity of Christ, tools, and man that would empower Africans to build self-supporting missions and avoid an infantilizing dependency. In addition, Faduma noted that civilization was double-edged, bringing along with its virtues, quote, the vices of the white man in Africa. Chief among those vices was the prevalence of illicit relations with African women. Polygamous white men, as Faduma phrased it, have placed mighty obstacles in the way of the gospel. Finally, Faduma intimated that Christianity itself was not immune from the heathenizing influences, heathenizing is the term that he used, of rival belief systems. Among these, he listed not only alternative faiths such as Mormonism or Judaism, but also the parochialisms of racial and caste arrogance. And to quote Faduma again, in India, the weakness of Christians is caste feeling. In the United States of America, it is color prejudice, another form of caste, end of quote. However sobering his litany of drawbacks, Faduma concluded on a positive note, claiming the benefits of exploration, commerce, and the partition of Africa as missionary agents and paths to modernization. In the end, successful missionary work was not rocket science. One needed only to refer to the heroic efforts of such forerunners as Bishop Samuel Ajay Crowther, who translated the Bible into the Yoruba language. Faduma shared Cromwell's belief in the importance of an African ministry, though he believed that foreigners were necessary conduits to that objective. John Smythe, editor of the Richmond newspaper The Reformer, and fresh from having served for 9 years as a U.S. minister to Liberia, approached these matters with more urgency and indignation than did Faduma and Cromwell. Smythe was less concerned with the missionary enterprise. Of greater moment was his need to refute those who opposed emigration to Liberia. Noting an aversion among too many educated African Americans to any discussion of Africa, Smythe attributed this form of alienation to the race's reliance on suspect information on the continent predicated on whites' claims of African backwardness. Smythe offered a vindication of the record of African Americans in Liberia, a beacon of independent statehood that had managed to evade the imperial snares of Britain, France, and Spain. He urged African Americans in the South to consider that Liberia presented a better opportunity than anywhere else for the race to prove its capacity for self-government and statecraft. Smythe denounced Europe's destructive role in the slave trade, subjecting Africa to political disintegration, social anarchy, moral and physical debasement, and the demise of indigenous economies. Worse, these horrors were compounded by an abundant literature of negrophobic degradation and proscription, fueling the existential alienation of Black Americans in Western culture. Against this, the Negro's well-meaning defenders could only muster patronizing, apologetic defenses of their humanity. For example, Negroes have souls to save just like whites. 200 years of slavery had so alienated had so alienated American Negroes from Africa and themselves that the continent was of less interest to the educated and refined Negro than it was to his industrious and adventurous white fellow citizens. To quote Smythe, "There is error in the system of religion, a mistake in the system of education that so alienates brother from brother and sister from sister," end of quote. And Smythe goes on to say, particularly when they derive from the same racial origin. How might the breach between the American Negro and Africa be healed? How might the ancient glories of African civilizations receive their due? Drawing on 19th century theories that posited a mystical basis for race pride and patriotism akin to kinship and the family, Smythe held that African Americans would forever be an alien people whose true character and destiny would not be realized among dominant white Americans. Race pride prevented, quoting Smythe, the Saxon from recognizing excellence in a race foreign and alien to his race, end of quote. Smythe recommended the scholarly writings of Africanus Horton and Bishop Crowther, arguing that, quote, "the testimony of Africans, distinguished for their knowledge of their countrymen, should be looked to and consulted as authorities in these matters," end of quote. Smythe's eclectic African archive included Blyden, Herodotus, and Mungo Park. Building on these authors, Smythe called for anthropological study of the traits and character of African tribal groups in Sierra Leone and Liberia, venturing his own survey of the Igbo, Manding, and Kru peoples. Smythe promoted opportunities for independent land ownership for immigrants to Liberia, and emphasized that immigrants possess as correct a knowledge of Africa as may be obtained from the writings of trustworthy African travelers and explorers and missionaries, reinforced by race loyalty and with greater confidence in himself and his race than in any alien self or alien race. The ostensible concern of African American participants in the Congress with the role of African American missionaries in Africa provided a platform for the more difficult underlying questions about diaspora consciousness engaged by Smythe and others. Out of what material, historical, ideological, rhetorical ideas can the basis for Pan-African solidarity be fashioned? On what basis might an affinity between American Negroes and Africans be created? During the Congress on Africa, the growing demand voiced by some for independent knowledge about Africa and its peoples, produced by African scholars, occasioned the spread of missions and European colonization in Africa was, in effect, an expression of elite African Americans' struggles to come to terms with their own attenuated citizenship in the post-Reconstruction United States. The Congress on Africa marks an early point, but a significant one, of convergence linking the parallel histories of racial subordination, the short century of colonialism in Africa, and the period of like duration of Jim Crow segregation in the U.S. Thank you.
so much, Professor James, for a wonderful speech. I learned a lot, actually, from this. And I would like to just open, although there will be tomorrow, just was reminded that there will be a closed reading and response to a paper by Professor Carl Boyce Davis, but we'll open the chance today just for a few questions. Any questions? Yes. Say the microphone.
I can grab an extra microphone.
Yes, that's fine. I probably don't need it, but I will need it. Yeah.
My name is Andrea Silva-Baitiki in the Africana Center, and we have another illustrious colleague who's having an event in Binghamton, Professor Ali Mazrui, and he asked me specifically to greet all of you and express his regrets. Most of us are here, some of us are in Binghamton, a few of us are going back and forth. I just finished a panel and ran here, so I want to make sure that it is recorded that Professor Mazrui regret very much not being able to join us. Thank you so much for this brilliant presentation, so much in it. I have quite a few questions, but I'll limit them to maybe 2. Well, someone said when we are exposed to the process of education, the Western process of education, that's part of what alienates us and the process of brainwashing. When the Ashmont Institute was created, which later became Lincoln University, those who were being trained were specifically being trained to go to West Africa, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and also Central Africa to Gabon as those missionaries indeed. But there was skepticism among some of them. There was a graduation speech that was given by somebody who was astonished them. He said things that were not expected, that Africa was in light, was civilized when Europe was in darkness, something like that. But then, of course, after the Civil War, they changed their focus to contribute to domestic reconstruction. But my question is, at the Berlin conference, the United States was represented, not as a direct participant, having its share of Africa, but as an observer. My first question is, did the Congress or did this African-American elite, conservative elite, did they have a contribution in terms of what role, even behind the scene, the US should play? That's my first question. My second question is, if the American Colonization Society had not taken the lead in organizing, orchestrating everything for the return to Africa that created Liberia, do you think that with this conservative leadership, it may not have made a difference in terms of how they would have interacted, approached the so-called natives in order to create a new space that could be shared as opposed to exporting the American situation here of finding their own lesser important people among the so-called natives?
Okay, thank you for your questions. I trust you can hear me. The second question about the origins of Liberia through the American Colonization Society is it's a difficult question. The American Colonization Society was not an anti-slavery entity, and a lot of the African Americans who went to Liberia under its aegis and had leadership positions in the formation of this Americo-Liberian elite were, in some cases, the slaves, the emancipated slaves of Southern Confederate leaders. General Lee's slaves went to Liberia, and I forget the name of the gentleman, but he was very prominent in leadership. So there's a study comparing the American Colonization Society in Liberia with the Church Missionary Society's role in founding Sierra Leone. And it argues that Sierra Leone was much more a product of a sort of an anti-slavery, evangelical reform culture than Liberia. So in many respects, the early leadership, the early American leadership that sort of merged into the Americo-Liberian leadership has been very controversial, and the historians still debate the significance of that role, and usually the debate plays out in terms of folks who are maybe more sympathetic to the legacy of the Confederacy, who try to defend the activities of some of the African American leaders in Liberia. But at any rate, it's a very complicated history in Liberia, and also the work of Claude Clegg, who is looking at the emigrations and the difficulties faced by the migrants and the challenges basically to survive, because he finds a high amount of mortality in the Liberian census. But he also writes about these wars of colonization between the American settlers and the indigenous people in Liberia. To go back to your first question, which, okay, what was that again?
The Berlin Conference.
Oh, the Berlin Conference. Were African Americans involved in the debate around the Berlin Conference? I'm not aware of any African Americans who were involved in the debate. You're correct that the United States had a presence there, but it seems to me that and this is something that I'm just getting back into researching, but African Americans were commentators sort of after the fact, and they, by and large, were hopeful. They had identified the problem in Africa as the expansion of the indigenous African slave trade, and they felt that the European presence was going to end that particular problem. Not exactly able to sort of see down the road the consequences of colonization.
Any other questions?
Hello, Kevin. It's wonderful to see you here. I have to say that Kevin came and spoke at the Du Bois Center soon after his book on African Americans in Ghana. Thank you. And I just have a comment on the irony of, well, I've just been rereading some of our mourned Chinua Achebe's nonfiction and some of his essays, and he says that Up From Slavery was the only work of American writing that his British secondary school in Nigeria allowed. The only American work at all was Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery. And it's interesting how significant, how great a significance Washington exerted in Africa, not just through that autobiography, but the work in advising South African, the South African system on training Africans and so forth. And so I'm wondering, did he at least propose that some African Americans go as consultants or advisors or trainers to South Africa or any other African country?
Thank you, Anne.
Washington, I think, had this model for industrial education that he wanted to replicate throughout the world and replicate on behalf of Africans and people of African descent. And there is some scholarship on a project of trying to have an industrial education project in Togo, in which the agriculturalists would assist Africans in the production of cotton. Washington certainly had a global consciousness. He often would deploy it to, again, talk about how emigration was not really the solution for African Americans. He'd go to Europe, and then he would write letters back to the US press saying, you know, there's a lot of poverty in Europe. These white people are poor in Europe, so African Americans, you're really, it wouldn't be a good idea for you to imagine that Europe has greener pastures. The thing about Washington, though, he was, and it's kind of hard for us to imagine, but he was a beacon for people of African descent throughout the world. As the most powerful African American leader, Claude McKay originally came to the United States from Jamaica, planning to study at Tuskegee Institute, to basically go learn agricultural methods and then go back to Jamaica. And of course, he got sidetracked from that, as we all know. Marcus Garvey wanted to meet with Booker T. Washington after he had founded the UNIA in Jamaica. He initially imagined the UNIA as an institution that would promote industrial education on the Tuskegee model. So it's a little bit ironic, given where Claude McKay and Marcus Garvey eventually ended up, far from the sort of conservative significance or impact of Washington, but he was a beacon to the black world, and someone who is very influential in that regard, maybe influential in ways that he could not have imagined.
Okay, other questions? Okay. Sorry. Go ahead. You're the guest.
I'm trying to restrain myself.
Okay. One of the questions I think, and I appreciate your presentation, and this being the opening presentation, because I teach a course called From the Age of Booker T. Washington to the Age of Barack Obama, my survey of African American history for the 20th century. So this is very pertinent to my teaching. But could we for a moment just examine this issue of Washington's conservatism? You said, you quoted the Atlanta Exposition Address where he said, cast down your bucket in every manly way, right? So while during that particular moment, given the demise of Reconstruction, given the violence that had occurred, given the, in some ways, precarious position that African Americans were in, Washington's doctrine of self-help, it seems to me to be something that we could see not as so much of a concession and not so conservative as it's been made out to be. I'm asking this for purposes of discussion, not necessarily for an expression of my personal beliefs, okay?
Thank you, Bob, for that question. I saw you writing down little notes, and I thought, oh, here it comes. But the question is there another way for us to think about Washington as maybe a little bit more in a more nuanced way than just sort of seeing him as conservative. And I think what I was saying before about how Washington had inspired all of these folks from all over the world, the black world, is one example of the power and appeal of the self-help message. It's interesting when you look at photographs of Washington speaking, a lot of them will show a lot of African Americans in the audience. And to me, that suggests that at least on those occasions, something other than a rigid color line is happening, first of all. Washington had a really difficult task. He had to run and maintain this institution within the belly of the beast in Tuskegee, Alabama, which is where all those violent confrontations of the civil rights movement took place. And the white population was fundamentally opposed to black education. So how is Washington able to sustain this institution in the face of that kind of opposition? Obviously, he has to make certain compromises so that he can function down there. And I think that in many respects, a critique of Washington's politics and his political effect really sort of has to take into consideration the difficulty of the inherent difficulties of the situation. The other thing about Washington is there's a moment earlier in African American leadership where he is sort of on the same page with everybody else. Bishop Walters, Ida B. Wells, people who are trying to come up with some sort of national civil rights organization. And there's a moment in the 1890s, I suppose, or maybe earlier, which he peels off. But even though he is not publicly supporting these civil rights ventures, he is contributing money behind the scenes to fund legal challenges to segregation laws. So he's functioning sort of covertly for a pro-civil rights position. Washington eventually, I think, becomes limited by his conservative rhetoric. And there are moments when he wanted to criticize racism and criticize, there were moments when he tried to sort of step out of that sort of rather narrow conciliatory posture that he had set up for himself. But whenever he did, he would just be, excoriated by the white South, the leadership of the white South. So in a way, he had kind of painted himself into a corner. Self-help would remain, I think, a really compelling part of black politics. And you would see folks talking about self-help, self-determination in the Garvey movement and afterward. So I think if you want to talk about Washington's speech and situate Washington's speech, as I tried to do, within a moment where there's a lot of debate within black leadership, there's debate on this question of mobility and immigration. And this is a moment where for black people in the South who are just disfranchised and dealing with political violence, about the only card they can play is mobility, is getting out and sort of removing their power as workers and consumers from an oppressive situation. And Washington, and what I'm trying to argue here is that Washington in the Atlanta Exposition Address is taking that card, that trump card, not a very strong trump, but it's all that black people have, he's taking it off the table. And I think that's a momentous decision and very significant. That doesn't necessarily contradict the appeal of his message of self-help and self-reliance, which other folks, certainly resonated with a lot of folks. But it's a very complex issue, and I think we could just keep debating it, But thank you for your question.
Maybe I'll just think. Oh, go ahead, please.
I was very excited to hear you talking about this global impact. of Washington, because it reminded me of some research that I was doing recently about, I don't know how you would call people in Suriname, because they're mixed up in everybody in Suriname is mixed up, you know, one way or the other. Chinese, Indian, European, African, not everybody, but, so people of color, let's put it this way, in Suriname. I was doing some research this summer, and I was reading a Dutch newspaper with help of some people to translate it, that was talking about this man who was being celebrated by his church because he was leaving, this was 1905, to go to Booker's school in Alabama. Well, I knew exactly Booker's school, what Booker's school was in Alabama. So I think this is important, and I really say, look for this. Now, I do diaspora as well as African American, so this is a diaspora in a diaspora context. This is South America. We're not talking about the West Indies. We're talking about people in South America. So the idea of the newspaper calling it Booker School, not Tuskegee Institute, I thought was fascinating. So of course I investigated it, and sure enough, that's what happened. But I really think that you're onto something with that. If we look for it, I think we'll find it.
Thank you, Rosalind. Your observation brought me back to the first question that mentioned Lincoln University. And Lincoln University was founded, you know, as a somewhat, I mean, I think what the founders of Lincoln were a bit more progressive in their whole view, and I think there was a greater space for, it wasn't just about the evangelization of Africa, but it was about the development of Africa and training of African leadership. And in a way, it's very similar to the Church Missionary Society of England under Bishop Crowther. You know, Bishop Crowther basically saw his job as training an African ministry. And the Nigerian historian A.J. Ajayi argues that work that Crowther did formed a new elite that would be very important for the rise of nationalism in Nigeria. But places like Tuskegee, they were a beacon for folks from all over the world, from the black world. And there's something about that really sort of transcends or goes well beyond the sort of the immediate political and ideological sort of limitations of Tuskegee. Lincoln University became the place of the destination for a lot of African nationalist leaders who were advised not to go to British institutions because the British were going to, you know, do a number on their heads and their psychologies and make them a little bit less likely to resist colonialism. And so Lincoln, if you think about the Lincoln University in the 1920s, it's got to be influenced by the New Negro and Garveyism and that whole militancy. And so you have people like Langston Hughes and Thurgood Marshall at Lincoln, along with Kwame Nkrumah and Ezekwe. Yeah. So there's something about these historically black colleges that recruit or attract Africans, folks from the Caribbean, and you have these historically black colleges as being these really cosmopolitan black world spaces that sort of further the kind of the ideological and political work and legacy of Garveyism. But that's really fascinating. It's not just what Booker T. Washington was trying to do with Tuskegee. It's how these people looking to Tuskegee from, you know, various points in the black world, it's how they perceive it and how they define Tuskegee in light of their own aspirations.
Okay, I guess I lost question. What actually fascinated me about your readings of the statements by the African American ministers and other elites at this Congress that you mentioned is the implication of their statements on the debate about modernity in Africa. I mean, of course, the way they framed it is within a Christian or religious terms, but I'm sure I wondered through your work, your book, which is definitely dealt with the African American, the era of decolonization in Africa, whether you see a continuity in terms of the same debate on modernity in Africa. And I say this, I mean, I didn't read the book, and that actually ties me to actually read it, is to see if there's a continuities, even in arguments like, let's say, by Richard Wright in his address to Kwame Nkrumah, for example. You see threads and debate on modernity and what the modern African state should look like. You see traces of that, especially in sometimes the backlash or the reaction to works by Maya Angelou on her trip to Africa. And the same even with Saidiya Hartman. The African reaction to it actually carries some of those things. So I wonder in your work, in later work, you see a continuity between, you know, these kind of narratives about modernity or abuse.
I think for African Americans at the turn of the century, like in 1895 or in 1930, in the context of this sort of nationalist upsurge throughout the Black world and the outrage over Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in the mid-1930s, you have a sort of a heightened awareness and a sense of solidarity and connection throughout the Black world. And that's a very sort of unusual moment, unusual situation. And it becomes an occasion for the spreading of information across the African diaspora. So you have greater interest in African affairs in the African American press. You have Africans who are African students in the United States who are making contributions to the press and speaking at certain forums. So you have the potential for more communication and a sort of international print culture that reduces these vast differences. And that becomes a moment of education for African Americans, certainly, about African political aspirations and modernity and political organizations and movements. And the other thing about the invasion of Ethiopia, African Americans, or at least that segment of African Americans that are aware of African affairs, interested in Africa, know that Ethiopia defeated Italy in 1896. So there is this knowledge that is maybe not at the forefront at all the time within African American public culture, but there is this knowledge of African modernity that for all of the dominant myths about Africa and the Dark Continent, there are folks who know and can cite certain events and examples that sort of disprove that. And that seems to me to be a constant problem or issue throughout from the late 19th century and the era of colonization to the era of decolonization. How widespread and how widely available is information about Africa that would counter all the sort of the ideological propaganda that Americans get, the Tarzan movies and all of that sort of thing. And that seems to be a perennial problem, a perennial challenge. And Maya Angelou, in her book, The Heart of a Woman, writes very powerfully and evocatively of that moment in the 1950s, late 1950s, early 1960s, when the emergence of new African governments has a transformative impact on African Americans' identities and their sense of themselves and their own possibilities. She has this great scene where she's depicting a group of African Americans in Harlem outside a furniture store, and there are televisions playing, on the other side of the window. And of course they can't hear what's being said. And they're riveted to the spot because there's an African, I think Ghanaian diplomat in his national dress at the podium at the UN, and he's holding forth. And they are just so riveted by this sight and very proud. And then they can't hear what he's saying, but they project onto the image what they imagine him to be saying. They imagine him to be telling off the white man, etc. But it's kind of a funny scene, but it really gets at something. It really gets at this image of African modernity through new African states, at the United Nations, speaking, acting on an equal basis within, among the world of nations. So this issue of African modernity is a constant one. It just gets played out at different moments in different ways.
Well, thank you so much. Please join us outside for a reception. And the program will continue tomorrow starting at 9:30, and I hope you'll join us too for that. So thank you so much.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so you're there. Okay, great.